Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Dr. Gabriel Andrade. Hello, Gabriel. How are you doing?
Hello, Lipton. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, the pleasure really belongs to me and my guest because we have the opportunity to pick brilliant minds like yourself. So it's really our pleasure. So, Gabriel, recently you wrote a piece titled The Relativist Disdain for Intelligence." 33 pages, and I read all of it. It's quite fascinating. Gabriel, why would one oppose intelligence as a concept?
Well, because basically, if you accept intelligence as a concept, then you're establishing hierarchies. You're saying that some people may be more intelligent than others. And that seems to run counter against the common idea of equality. And as our world is, at least ideologically, becoming increasingly egalitarian, uh, keeping into consideration that the great revolutions of the past centuries, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and so on, they were all about bringing more equality to the world because in the ancient regime, uh, hierarchy was naturally established in aristocracies and monarchies and so on. So inequality in the last 3 centuries has had a bad name. And I would say justifiably so, because I mean, the inequalities that were rampant in France before the French Revolution, they were horrible, right? And they were not legitimate. They were not based on merit or anything like that. It was just the king, and he was king because somehow people believed that God appointed him in that position, or that was the natural order of things, and so on. So that inequality was very illegitimate. And then as a result of the French Revolution, people began to say, well, equality is a value in and of itself. But of course, if you take that so far to the other extreme, then you will end up saying that whoever claims that some people might be more intelligent than others, they are bigots. And of course, I try to counter against that. I try to push back against that notion. So I suppose that is the reason why the concept of intelligence scandalizes so many people today in the world.
But I guess that these opponents of intelligence are suffering from cognitive dissonance. Many of them spend thousands of dollars, or should we even say millions, to ensure that their children attend elite colleges.
Yes, of course. I mean, do as I say, not do as I preach, not as I do. Right? That's the old thing that's going on with many of these people. Yeah. Well, I suppose they would say something like, yeah, we send our kids to these colleges, but the way these colleges should teach is not only to focus on the cognitive aspects of education, but also on the many alleged. You're probably aware that there are really two theories regarding intelligence. There is the G factor theory, which claims that intelligence is a thing that we can measure and it encompasses all cognitive abilities. And then there's the multiple intelligence theory, which says, well, if you're not good at math or communication and so on, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're not good at other skills, right? And I suppose these people who send their kids to colleges and so on, they even though they send them to school, to these schools and so on, they're still egalitarians in the sense of saying that, well, our kids are developing in this particular area, but they won't necessarily be smarter than the other kids who may not go to these schools, but they may develop intelligence in other ways, right? The thing is that research, I think, has firmly established that the G factor theory is actually the right one and not the multiple intelligence theory. I mean, IQ, which basically measures G, general intelligence, is predictive of many other things in life. And I think that's strong evidence that there is such a thing as a thing such as intelligence underlying many other of our skills in daily life. Now, that doesn't mean that IQ will determine everything in your life. There are other psychological variables at play, but IQ is pretty powerful in predicting what your outcomes will be.
What a response. And I do agree with you. Gardner's thesis is inaccurate. IQ predicts job performance, income, and the quality of governance, along with many other significant variables. Secondly, the G factor perspective is more compelling. Students who are good at English more than likely are also good at physics. And secondly, if they are not as good at physics, they're not going to fail it badly. So when people say if you're good at English and you're not good at mathematics, you're still smart, they're not necessarily wrong, but they need to look at the variations in your success, or the national level variations in success.
Indeed, I agree. Absolutely. Now, of course, you're saying, I mean, if you're not good in English, well, we do have to be put this in context. I mean, this is for the English-speaking world. If we transpose this to another setting, then it's if you're not good in whatever language they speak there. But yes, you are absolutely right that in saying that language skills and communication skills do correlate with mathematical skills. And not only that, but a host of many other variables too, including things such as emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, and so on. So it's simply not true that there is no correlation between the alleged multiple sides of intelligence. Now, they're not necessarily identical, so I may grant Gardner that point, but they're strongly correlated.
Yes, and students care about the tilt. So one leading intelligence researcher, Thomas Coyle, he has several pieces on the tilt. So if you are competent in English, you're more likely to study sociology or English than economics. But this does not indicate that you are inept at mathematics. People care more about the tilt. So some people have a verbal tilt, others have a quantitative tilt.
Yes, absolutely. I agree.
But I subscribe to Linda Gottfriedsen's definition of intelligence. Intelligence enables us to navigate a complex environment. It's bigger than passing an exam.
Of course, of course. And I mean, it is true that nobody has come up with a fully satisfactory definition of intelligence. So we may grant that, but there is something called the Socratic Fallacy. And if you remember from philosophy, or your listeners are aware of this, I mean, Socrates would go around Athens asking questions, and many of these questions would be definitions, and people would not be able to define something in particular. So he would ask, what is justice? And people would give examples of justice, but Socrates would reply, presenting examples of something that is not properly justice, but falls under what his counterparts would say. So Socrates would give people a very hard time defining something. But the Socratic fallacy is to believe that just because you cannot define something, that something does not exist. And I think something like that may be going on with intelligence. It is true that however you define intelligence, there may always be one or two counterexamples that weaken that definition. I mean, that is correct. But that doesn't mean that we should give up altogether the concept of intelligence. Maybe we just need to keep working hard in order to define it. Now, going back to what you're saying regarding Godfrey, this famous researcher, I forgot her name, but I know who she is.
Linda Gottfriedsen.
Yeah, Linda Gottfriedsen. Going back to her point, she does have, you and her do have a very important point here. This is more than just about passing an exam. Some people might say that IQ measures the ability to pass an IQ exam, but that's not true. IQ has high validity. It has both high reliability and high validity. Now, in psychometrics, reliability means that whenever you take an exam, and let's say you take it 1 month later or 1 year later, you will get very similar results. IQ tests have that. Right? But it also has validity in the sense that it measures what it claims to measure. And how do you know this? Well, it's basically by predicting. If a test is good enough to predict another variable, then that has good validity. And IQ tests, IQ results do have enough predictive power for other validities, which, by the way, cannot be said of other tests that are more fashionable now. such as, for example, the implicit association test.
I'm happy that
Which,
you're mentioning the implicit association test, because I interviewed Lee Jusim, who's somewhat of an expert in this area, and we both conclude that for the most part, the evidence is sketchy.
indeed, because with the implicit association test, as opposed to IQ tests, there is no reliability. It's it's not stable at all. One day you're a racist, a week later you're not. And it goes back and forth. It dances around, right? So if you are not getting consistent,
Yes.
and that's not reliable. Now, psychometricians have always said that reliability is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition. A test, even if the implicit association test were reliable, which is not, but even if it were reliable, it would still not be a good test because it is not valid. It doesn't measure what it claims to measure. And how do we know this? Well, because the people who are labeled racist on the basis of this test, in real life, they do not behave as racist, and they do not exhibit the alleged unconscious biases that they have. And there may also be theoretical explanations as to why this test is not valid.
No, the implicit test, the implicit association test is invalid because it is predicated on subjective assumptions of racism. So for example, if one creates a literary company and most of the reviewers are white, this can be construed as an example of racism.
Yes, indeed. And I do agree with you that the disparities in numbers are not necessarily evidence of racism. I mean, there could be many other reasons why the literary company has an executives or writers not have anything to do with racism. But apart from that, the issue, to go back to my original point regarding the implicit association test, the lack of validity regarding that test is that even if you may seem to exhibit on the basis of the test some bias identifying, let's say, Black people with crime and white people with academic excellence, that doesn't necessarily reflect your own bias, but it might actually reflect your awareness that in society there is such a bias, which is different. Because if I come to associate unconsciously, let's say in the sense that I'm slower to make an association between Blacks and academic excellency and whites and crime, if I'm slower to make that association, which is what the implicit association test basically measures, that doesn't necessarily mean that I myself believe that Blacks are more prone to crime and whites are more prone to academic excellency. No. I may have more difficulty in making fast enough because I am a racist myself, but simply because I am aware that these stereotypes are out there in society and it's hard for me to make the connections fast enough. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I subscribe those stereotypes, which is the main criticism against implicit association tests. I think it's a ridiculous I mean, it's interesting, it's creative, but it's very dangerous if it is used by companies or by public institutions in order to determine who is a racist and who's not a racist. Because I mean, think about it. What if you failed the test? Then what's the solution? Will you be mandated to go to a psychologist to explore your unconscious and confess your tendencies and totalitarian aspect to it, in the sense that, I mean, if it's a more or less a form of mind reading, this is what it pretends to be. And once you predicate something on the basis of mind reading, you're closer to totalitarianism, in the sense that you want to reform other people's minds by using a very faulty test that will tell you what you may think is on somebody else's mind when that's not necessarily the case.
Gabriel, verified beliefs are not conspiracies, neither are these beliefs stereotypes. So for example, there are racial differences in academic performance. This is a verified belief, therefore it cannot be a stereotype. Another objection with the notion of an implicit bias test is that the test itself is biased and subjective. It does not take science seriously. Verified assumptions are not stereotypes. So for example, there are well documented sex differences in personality and cognition. This is not a stereotype.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Now, of course, I mean, I agree with you that I don't know how it is in Jamaica or in the Caribbean as a whole, but in Latin America and the US, it is true that the Black incarceration rate is higher than the white incarceration rate. So technically speaking, to associate Blacks with criminals, well, you would say it's not so much a stereotype because it does have a basis on reality. That's true. But we could also say that, well, yeah, but I mean, additionally, some people might go overboard and not just judge this on the basis of numbers, but immediately assume that a Black person is a criminal. So I do think that it's worth exploring how these stereotypes, whether or not they're out there, and how they can be reformed. I do not close the door on the possibility that such stereotypes exist and that they do not really have a basis on reality. But I think that the implicit association test just doesn't work for this. Something else has to come up. And I mean, that's the way science works. So I think the implicit association test may have been an interesting beginning. It may have opened the door for an important conversation, but it's time to move on because it just has not passed the scientific requirements, as you will say.
Yes, and another problem with the implicit bias association test is that naturally we're biased people. We exhibit prejudice. So, for example, many people conflate height with competence. Beauty is also conflated with competence. So it's really dubious to create a test to examine bias when bias undergirds the reality of being alive.
Well, I do agree with you, obviously, that we're all biased, but I don't think we should be prisoners to it. If there is a way to detect it and somehow work on reducing it, I'm all for it. So as a teacher, I'm an educator. I mean, my job is to spot biases in students and make them see why their biases are wrong. So I don't think we should give up in the fight against bias. And I think much of our cognitive progress throughout the 3 last centuries is precisely to combat bias and to identify fallacies and to engage in critical thinking. Because I mean, basically, this is what critical thinking is about, to reduce bias. So I don't think we should, even though I do acknowledge the power of bias, and I agree with you that bias is very, very powerful and that it's dubious that we'll ever be able to overcome it. We should not give up altogether on it. So, I mean, I would agree with that. But the thing is that the implicit association test is not the best way to overcome bias. So that's what I'm saying. And I go back to my original point. We need to find more creative ways of fighting bias. I think something much more humble and less sensational can be done. And that is engaging with critical thinking. I mean, you're much more likely to make someone less biased if you teach them critical thinking rather than make them go through this ridiculous implicit association test, and even more ridiculous, the diversity training that many companies in the US and so on go through. I think that doesn't take us anywhere.
No, not at all. But when we're combating bias, we must appreciate that some level of bias is actually relevant. We therefore ought to ask ourselves an important question: is bias credible? If you're employing a worker and this individual will be required to perform the duties of an accountant, you're going to want someone with a degree in accounting or an individual with experience. So bias is not always negative.
I agree. And I would say that ultimately our task as educators should be to try to reduce irrational bias. But of course, let's say first impressions or correlation of some variables with other variables are a good way of predicting someone's behavior. So in that sense, all those examples you mentioned, I think they are reasonable. But what the critical thinking educator ought to do is try more to eradicate irrational bias, not so much rational discriminations, which are necessary. And we all, I mean, take a look, for example, at racial profiling. A lot of people would say this is unethical. And yes, maybe some cops are overzealous with this. But profiling takes place at all levels. I mean, look at insurance companies. Are they biased against young people when they sell insurance plans for cars? You know, the young people, they have to pay higher fees. Well, yes, they are biased, but as you very well say, this is something that is necessary, because take a look at the statistics. Who has more reckless behavior when driving, the younger people or older people? Who engage in more risky behaviors? Obviously young people. Right now, does that mean that all young people will do this kind of thing? No, it doesn't. But I think
Probability. It's the probability.
exactly, probability. So the insurance companies do have to play it safe, and ultimately they do have to make this decision on the basis of some variables, in this case age, and discriminate. And that's the way it is. Now, is this reasonable discrimination? I would say it is. And the big question is, if we accept this sort of age discrimination, and nobody seems to complain, can we do it also with gender? Can we do it with race? Well, that's, I would say it's a bit more difficult in those cases, but we should not abandon that conversation altogether.
No,
So,
but
yeah.
we do acknowledge sex discrimination. So, for example, male students are more likely to be punished by their teachers because teachers often misconstrue the adventurous nature of boys as being dangerous. So male students are more likely to be punished across the world, in the developing world and also in the developed world. There's also the notion of the stereotype bias. People, well, not people, but teachers tend to have higher expectations for girls because they conflate pro-sociality with academic excellence. So boys tend to be rowdy. Teachers like students who pay attention. In other words, teachers are privileging those who are higher in conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is correlated with academic performance, but being conscientious does not necessarily mean that you're a genius. Genius performance is more likely to be correlated with novelty seeking traits and risk tolerance, and men are higher on these measures. So yes, we do accept various levels of bias, especially in the arena of sex.
Indeed, and I plead guilty to that crime. I mean, as an educator, it is true that girls will talk more in class than boys. I mean, talk to the teacher, right? And when when you ask a question, the ones who will raise their hands, it's more likely to be girls, because as you're saying, well, they probably have higher communication skills, but that does not necessarily mean that they will score higher on the exam. And of course, you may get the wrong impression that because the girls are the ones raising their hands, you should expect of them higher scores than boys, when that is not necessarily the case when you take a look at the numbers. So yes, you do have a point there, and I think it's a very well taken.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like even in the era of crime, men and women may commit similar atrocities, but men are more likely to be punished.
Yes, and of course that is a discrimination that needs to be addressed. But again, we go back. This is a very good example, because of a good example of what we were speaking about before regarding disparities. Now, who commit more crimes? Who are more likely to be punished? Well, men commit more crimes than women. And who are more likely to be punished? Again, men are more likely to be punished than women. Now, is it fair that for the same crime, men get more punishment than women? I would say it is not fair. So we do need to correct that bias. But we
Especially,
do need,
sorry, Gabriel, especially in the area of sexual molestation.
yes, indeed. I mean, it's still true, I think. I don't know the statistics, but as far as I know, it's still true that when it comes to sexual molestation, men are still more represented than women, but that doesn't mean that women will not do it. And it is definitely true, as you say, that men for the same crime will be punished more harshly than women, right? Now, that's something that we need to fight against. It is a bias. It is not a rational bias. And we need to engage in critical thinking in the sense that justice requires that whoever commits the same crime should get the same penalty. Now, the same thing may apply to race. It is true, or at least mostly true, because this has also been challenged, but let's assume that it is true that whites or other more privileged groups, they may get less punishment than blacks for committing the same crime. That's something that we definitely need to address, but we should not dismiss the fact that just as men get more punishment, but at the same time, they also commit more crimes than women, we should also move that argument to the area of race, and we should fight against the excessive punishment that's given to blacks as compared to whites for the same crime. But at the same time, we should also acknowledge that in many countries, I don't know if in all of them, but in many countries with black and white populations, black populations are they have a higher crime rate. So we should
Yes.
acknowledge both things. We should acknowledge both things, just as we do with in the area of sex. In the area of or gender, in the area of gender, we admit that men are punished more harshly, but at the same time, we admit that men are more likely to commit crimes. I think the same should go for in the area of race.
Yes, so in Jamaica, minority groups are quite small. So the Chinese, whites, and the Syrians, they occupy a small minority in the society. But in Jamaica, working class blacks who reside in urban areas are more likely to commit crimes. And even when we compare working class blacks to working class whites, working class blacks are still likely to compare crimes to commit crimes. And I know this because in Germantown, the whites are poor and it is not a crime center. But there are also interesting case studies. So maroon communities are not particularly wealthy, but their crime rate is low. And this is a form of cultural selection to survive during slavery. Even though the maroons had obtained their independence, they had to promote conformity, conscientiousness, and rule following. So even today, maroon communities are still less likely to commit crimes when compared to the larger population, even though they're not necessarily wealthy.
Yes, and I think you're putting your finger on an important aspect, because there may be the temptation of some people to immediately go for a biological explanation of why the black crime rate in Jamaica or in Latin America or in the US or even Europe is higher. And I mean, for some people, they rush and they say, well, it's because blacks may have higher testosterone or something like that, right? And I think, I mean, you shouldn't rule that out completely, but you also need to look at the social variables that may be at play. And you've provided a good example of one. I mean, if you come from slave communities as compared to maroon communities, the slave, I mean, it was far more dysfunctional to be in a slave structure. So maybe the way to survive was through violence, and those values were passed down through the generations. Whereas maroons, once they were settled in freedom, they didn't have to recourse to violence in the same manner. So here we have an example of how historical and social variables may ultimately have an effect on differences in crime rates have gone across different ethnic groups that does not necessarily have to do with biology. Now, the fact that we do not, that I myself, I'm not really prepared to accept a biological explanation for these differences, doesn't mean that these differences do not exist. They do exist. It's just that, and I don't know what the origins of that may be. There may be many other variables involved.
But biology is correlated with social pressures. So for example, testosterone is negative and positive. The positive of testosterone is that it is correlated with many variables that induce success and innovation. Over too much of it is a is a bad thing. So the issue is how testosterone works under a particular how testosterone operates within a particular environment. So a man from an upper class background who is dominant in testosterone may become a president or a CEO, but a man from a lower class background who did not get the appropriate training could become a gang lord.
Hmm. Indeed. Testosterone is a double-edged sword. And as you say, I mean, someone with not enough testosterone, well, they just wouldn't have the drive to do things and succeed. But maybe someone with that excessive testosterone, they may become overly aggressive, and therefore they may not succeed either. But also the context in which they are, as you say, it's a good example. But of course, I mean, I mentioned testosterone off the top of my head, but there have been other biologists who have claimed that differences such as brain size
Well,
or
brain
even
size
or
is
even the heat.
brain size is correlated with intelligence. This is not controversial in the academic community.
I don't know. You may be right, but I wouldn't say that's the controversial aspect. The controversial aspect is the cross-racial comparison, which someone like Jean-Philippe Rushton, who's he's one of the guys who
Yeah,
made
life history
who
strategy. He popularized life history.
yeah, that one. And he said that, those populations that had evolution in Africa as compared to the ones in Europe, uh, the strategy that they follow was smaller brains and like larger penises and more active sexuality and so on. Whereas in Europe, because of the cold weather, they needed to have larger brains and more investment in children and so on. I am not so sure that that theory really works. I'm not an expert on this,
Yeah.
but
J. Philippi Rushton, his conclusions are accurate, but the perspective is inapt, and it has been criticized by people like Edward Dutton. There's actually a relationship between the climate, delayed gratification, and intelligence. But J. Philippi Rushton's model needs to be refined.
I don't know, Lipton. I wouldn't comment on this because it's really not my area.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, I'm aware of his thesis. I know what he claims, but I don't have enough expertise to say whether or not he's right. So
yeah, but remember, it's a model, and like all models, maybe it is in need of new ideas. It doesn't mean that J. Philippi Rushton is incorrect. Maybe some variables embedded in the model are not accurate, but this does not necessarily indicate that J. Philippi Rushton is wrong. Personally, Gabriel, my approach to these issues is rather dispassionate. I don't lose sleep over them.
well, yeah, you're bringing up a good point. Even if Rushton were incorrect, as I tend to think he is, he still deserves to be discussed because the way he presented the ideas, I mean, they were, I wouldn't say necessarily reasonable, but at least reasonable enough to merit discussion. Now he may be wrong, who knows, or he may be right, but we shouldn't dismiss discussion of his ideas altogether. So I'm up all for discussions of this. It's just that my area of
Yeah,
expertise
it's
is not this.
different.
Yes, but I think that definitely he should not be canceled or put on a blacklist, and whoever discusses his ideas should be fired from a university. That's which unfortunately does happen. I remember he had a, a debate with Suzuki, who's a famous Canadian scientist. I mean, and he received insults and stuff like that. That's not the proper way to try to refute his claims. So unfortunately, and of course, with all these things going on in Western academia with cancel culture and so on, this is becoming increasingly the case. So I think even someone as Rushton deserves to be heard, and he may be right or he may be wrong. I don't know, but
But
definitely.
the works of Rushton were recently retracted, publicly retracted.
I wasn't aware of that. By whom? By the
But,
publishing house?
no, yeah, by an organization. I don't remember the name of the organization, but a fellow researcher was saying that even though Rushton is no longer alive, his works were retracted.
Well, that's a very foolish thing to
Yeah,
do. I
it's
mean,
really stupid.
Unless the person who is retracting that is saying, well, I gave my approval in the sense of saying that I think he was right and now I think he's wrong. Well, everybody has that right to retract. But if you're just, if you publish a book, your company published a book, let's say 20 years ago, and now you're saying, oh, we should have never published that book.
Yeah,
Well, why not?
that's just anodyne, very lame.
Say it
Yeah,
again. I
that's
lost you
just
there.
very lame, very lame. It's anodyne, very
It is
lame.
very lame. It is very lame because I mean, how I go back here to John Stuart Mill's famous defense of free speech. I mean, how can you refute someone's claim if you don't listen to that claim? And you should listen to that claim because if the claim is true, then you're missing out the truth. And if the claim is not true, then you're missing out the opportunity to persuade people that that is not true. So, I mean, I think just as it happened in any totalitarian system, such as the Soviet Union, when they, you know, they had forbidden books and so on, or the church for that matter, there will always be a black market for these books if they're censored. So the same goes for Rushton and any other of the so-called racial scientists who may have works that, okay, maybe people won't agree with them, but let them make their case.
But Gabriel, these issues for someone like myself who spends enough time reading dry academic studies, they are just average. I am not moved. So for instance, the black-white IQ gap is one of the most consistent findings in psychology, and we do have data suggesting that some groups have higher allelic frequencies associated with intelligence. I'm a black person. I am not offended. It is just the data.
Yeah,
And
of course, you should not be offended by data.
yeah, and I wonder where some people offended. On average, East Asians, they score higher on IQ than whites. Blacks score lower than whites, and that is just the data. And some Jewish groups, they score very high. There's nothing to
Yes.
discuss. We can always debate the cultural and evolutionary selections for the disparities in intelligence, but there's not much to discuss.
I agree. I agree. I mean, it's a hard fact and we have to face it. Now, as you say, it may be that the reasons are biological. It may be that the reasons are cultural or psychological, but
Or
the fact
long-term
remains.
evolutionary selections. Long-term evolutionary selections. It's just like the relationship between state history and modern development. Countries with an intermediate level of state history are wealthier because they are flexible countries. Countries with a longer duration of state history tend to be poor because the state over time becomes extractive. It is ossified. So Egypt and other places in North Africa and the Middle East with a longer duration of state history compared to Western Europe, today and America, they're not as wealthy because the state is naturally extractive. And when the state becomes quite old without being rejuvenated, it becomes a burden to the people.
Yeah, that's an interesting thesis.
Yeah, so I've interviewed many experts in the area of state history and I pay attention to the data. I'm not going to lose sleep over these issues.
Yes, well, I mean, but you do know that IQ has also improved over the years. This is
Yes,
the
yeah, the
so-called
Flynn
Flynn effect.
effect.
Yeah, now it is true that despite the Flynn effect, the racial gap has stayed. That is true. But it also tells you, I think, that if you put in enough education, you can improve it. So even some groups that, let's suppose, I'm not sure about this, but let's suppose that some groups do have allele frequencies that may code for lower IQ as compared to others. That does not necessarily mean that their cause is hopeless and that you should
No,
not provide education. No, education will still raise their IQ as per the Flynn effect, right? So, but now you were asking an important question. Why is there a refusal to come to terms with the hard data? Well, I think that those of us like you and I who bring up these numbers and these facts of the IQ racial gap, which you cannot elude, it's there. We have to be very careful and understand at least the history of theorizing that went on before the professionalization of psychometrics, because it is true that such a science was sloppy. I mean, this may surely the IQ tests and all that, at first they were far from perfect. They were not done in the language of the person in many cases with immigrants and so on. They were used for eugenic purposes in some instances. And even before that, in the 19th century, especially at the time of the American Civil War, there was a boom of racial theories, which today I don't think not even someone like Rushton would accept. So I think we do have to acknowledge the vicious history behind some of these theorizing. Now, just because there's a vicious history of that, that doesn't mean that the current state of knowledge is wrong. But it's understandable, the opposition to it. At least in my case, I understand it. Now, I don't give in and I say, well, I understand it, therefore you're right. No. What I would say is, I think you're wrong. You do have to face this, but I would go for a more gentle approach in the sense that I can understand where the counterpart frustration may come from.
Well, I understand the hesitation up to a point, but as someone who is not overly emotional, after that stage, I just become annoyed because the reality is that we are at a higher level of psychological maturation. The Flynn effect, IQ is increasing. There's a strong argument by those on the hereditary right and the cultural right that the Flynn effect is being reversed. So academics across the spectrum are arguing that the Flynn effect is now in reversal. But the truth is that even though the Flynn effect has reversed, we are still at a higher level of psychological maturation. And because we are at a higher level of psychosocial development, it is really dubious to expect a reprisal of race science.
Yes, I mean, I do hear every once in a while that yes, the Flynn effect might be reversing, but at least in the time frame that Flynn studied, which is from the beginning of the 20th century to the beginning of the 21st century, I think he proved well enough that such an effect exists. Now, for maybe some other reasons, it might be reversing. I suppose there may be many other variables at play, including geopolitical variables. I mean, I make the prediction right now, and I hope if you're recording, I think we can write it down on October the 18th, that maybe if the Taliban remain in Afghanistan, in 10 years time, Afghanistan IQ will decrease, obviously, because if you don't send girls to school, if you don't allow critical thinking and so on, there definitely the Flynn effect will be reversed there. So there may be many other variables at play, right? And maybe that may be one of the reasons why the Flynn effect is being reversed. Maybe because we've become disillusioned with critical thinking, maybe because of the growth of fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, whether it's Islamic, but also Christian and Jewish and even Buddhist. Let's not forget about those. So there may be geopolitical variables at play, but I think that at least for the last 100 years, the Flynn effect has been there. And I think Flynn, and I think he did a good enough job in explaining how it happened. And I don't think he ruled out biology completely, but he said, well, but look, environment does still play a role. And it certainly has to do with education. Now, there's an important thing here, because, I mean, the left sometimes wants to embrace Flynn as one of their own. And I think Flynn would resent that in the sense that he still considers intelligence to be something very important. He himself believed that IQ predicted a lot of things and that we need to keep watch of IQ. And I think he still acknowledged even the racial gap. So I wouldn't say that the left has a right to claim Flynn as one of their own, as some of them do. Because sometimes they quote Flynn in order to oppose the hard right. But I think Flynn would have little patience with those people who say, oh, IQ doesn't measure anything, it's a useless measure. No. I think Flynn was very firm in this. And even before Flynn, a lot of people feel discomfort with the Soviet Union, right? But I think the Soviets, as opposed to the current left, they also understood very well the importance of keeping track of intelligence and the efforts to improve intelligence. Because if you take a look at the history of psychology, Flint relied a lot on Luria. And
Yes.
Luria, who was a famous Russian psychologist, he had these famous experiments in Uzbekistan asking people to make very basic syllogisms, and they were not able to do that. And Luria, he did not mind saying, hey, look, these people are less intelligent than us. Now, what we have to do is try to raise them up to our level. But Luria never said something like, oh, they have their own intelligence, we have ours, they're not comparable. Cognitively speaking, we're on the same level. No, he clearly said, these people cognitively, they are not at the same level as we need to try to raise them through education. I think that was Flint's idea as well. And they're clearly opposed to the relativist frame of mind, which says, oh, all cultures are equal. There is no such thing as intelligence, or at least, if not that, everyone is intelligent in the same measure. No, I think Flynn and Luria would have laughed that off, really.
I am also familiar with the work of Lure, and you're correct. The old left is different from the social identitarian left. The old left was a Marxian left. The Marxian left cared about the global political economy. They're not going to lose sleep over sexual orientation.
Well, someone might even say that the old left was homophobic on its own, because, I mean, it is true that in places like Cuba, not far from Jamaica, there were internment camps for homosexuals and so on, right? So actually, they may have cared about sexual orientation, but not in the way that the current left,
and
the current left would think about it.
The old left was also quite sexist. They were not fond of women.
Well,
there are variations, but the old left had many sexist leaders who wanted women to stay home and do household duties.
I'm not a. Maybe you can tell me some of these leaders that were very sexist in what they claim.
George Watson has about the lost history of socialism, and Public Discourse magazine as a good citation. But the old left was very traditional. I get your point. I understand your point quite clearly, because in Soviet countries, women were employed in the labor force, but there were people on the left who did not care much for the rise of women empowerment.
Yeah, I think what was at stake here, it's more like, as we talked about at the beginning, it's more like do as I say, not as I do. So if you go back to the writings of Marx and Engels, and that famous book, The Origin of, I think it's called The Origin of Property and the Family and the State, they clearly urge women to go out and, break the chains of patriarchy and so on, right? And Lenin, he also, well, Lenin not so much, but some of the people that surrounded Lenin, like, for example, Alexandra Kolontai, who's a famous Soviet female leader, they also had these ideas that, women didn't need men, and that family was an oppressive institution and so on. But I think these were just the minority in Soviet leadership, and their ideas never really came to fruition. I think you also have to consider the power of Stalin as a leader in the Soviet Union, because Stalin definitely transformed and reversed many of the things that were going on. So I would say that from the time of the Bolshevik Revolution till the time of Stalin, there may have been a shift towards greater empowerment of women and so on, or at least that was the intention. But once Stalin stepped in, you have to really think that Stalin was more of a czar than a socialist leader. I mean, he imposed many of traditional values that had been challenged in the previous 40 years, all under the guise of communism, of course. But at stake, on a deeper level, they resemble far more the old Tsarist institutions than the revolutionary ideals of Marx and Lenin and so on. And ever since, I think that influence has remained, and today even more so with Putin, although of course Russia doesn't call itself socialist anymore. But I think worldwide, this pattern remains. So I think once Stalin stepped in and he brought in additional family values that resemble more the traditional morality of women staying at home and so on, I think the rest of the left worldwide follow that, although they never dare to admit openly that, that they didn't really care much about women. I mean, because obviously it's a cheap shot. I mean, you always you need, as a socialist leader, you always need applause lines. And of course, saying that women should be out on the market, on the street working and so on, that will get applause. But it's one thing to get an applause line, and it's actually quite another to actually implement policies that carry this out. And I think in most cases, for socialists, this was more of a do as I say and not as I do.
Yeah, but again, the left then, like now, it is a multifaceted left.
Yes, absolutely. I
Yeah,
agree
so
with that.
people have to be nuanced, but there are always outliers and weird examples. But what we do know is that the old left is way more conservative than the present left.
Yes, in terms of identities and sexuality and things like that, I would agree. Maybe not so much, and I guess we might disagree here. Maybe not so much in terms of economic equality.
No.
The current left doesn't care much about economic equality.
They pretend to. It's all pretense. They pretend to, but they're not radical. They're really the servants of the globalist.
And
many of their supposedly woke policies do not benefit minorities, as the Urban Institute recently said.
Absolutely. And not only that, but I would also add that the current left, I mean, this varies. I don't think in Europe it's the same as in America, but I'm speaking about North America in particular, although this is expanding worldwide. The left, in its obsession with identity, has left aside the concern with economic inequality to the point of saying that because they're so obsessed with race, race is more important than class, when I don't think that's the case in most instances. So they might, many on the left today end up saying ridiculous things, such as that Oprah or Michael Jordan are more oppressed than some poor white person living in a trailer in Alabama.
Well, according to the New York Post, that magazine, students are actually taught that white working class individuals are worse off than upper and middle class black people. Sorry, it's just the reverse. White working class people are better off than richer black people. Yes, it's the point.
Which is ridiculous. And it has perverse implications too, because ultimately what these youngsters, when they're taught that at universities, they end up thinking that if you're poor and you're white, it's because you blew it away, because you had all the privileges in the world and you could not find riches with that. And if you couldn't do that, it's basically because you deserve it, because you just don't have what it takes. And we see here the danger of this. So if you think that someone living in a trailer in Alabama or someplace like that is less oppressed than Oprah or Michael Jordan or whoever, then you're going to end up thinking that Oprah rose her way up, which, I mean, it might be true. I don't disqualify Oprah. She maybe she has what she deserves, but the counterpoint to that is also that the person living in the trailer, if he's white and he's living in the trailer, then he deserves also what he has.
Yeah.
And he's poor and nobody should help him.
Exactly.
There's nothing you can do for him.
It diminishes support for the white working class. This is what studies have shown.
Yes, exactly. Indeed.
It's crazy. It's really crazy.
It is crazy. It is crazy because let me finish here for a second. If you take a look at what Marx, I mean, we're comparing the current left with the 19th century left. So, for example, probably the most famous phrase in the Communist Manifesto is "Workers of the world unite." Now, a black person who's poor should feel solidarity with a white person who's poor, right? And that's what the old Marxism would have told them. But today it's different. Today, the black person is being told you should have solidarity with someone of your own skin, regardless of whether or not he's rich or not. And your white counterpart, who's as poor as you are, he's not your friend because historically he was your master or whatever, right? So this old phrase "workers of the world unite" no longer
redundant.
holds.
It is limiting transracial alliances. This is why wokeism is anti-Marxist and anti-left.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you're bringing this up, Lipton, because all the time I hear people on the right complain how Black Lives Matter and all this are a radical Marxist movement, and we have to be careful because look at what Marxism did to the world. Well, wait a minute. I don't think they're Marxists. If they were Marxists, they wouldn't be in bed with black millionaires who exploit everyone regardless of the race, as much as white millionaires too, of course, right? I mean, the main focus of Black Lives Matter, if they were truly Marxists, it would be class, not race. So I don't think it's accurate when critics on the right call them Marxists. And of course, the leader of Black Lives Matter, she's also self-proclaimed Marxist, but I don't think she is.
She's
I don't
not a
think she
real
has
no.
read.
The leader of Black Lives Matter is a part of the pseudo left. She may like Marx. She may even be a Marxist organizer in the political sense, but philosophically she's not Marxist. And this is why you're different from the mainstream American right. The mainstream American right is quite insipid.
Yes, exactly. Yes. And look, I think Marx would have seen this woke ideology as detrimental to liberation, because woke ideology ultimately, I mean, at the time of Marx, there was no wokeism. This is a very recent phenomenon, of course, but there was something similar, which was nationalism. Now, nationalism was basically in the time of Marx writings, we're talking 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, as Marx saw it, nationalism, which there was an explosion of nationalist sentiments because the Austro-Hungarian Empire was breaking down and so on, and also the Ottoman Empire. Marx would have said, and he actually wrote this down in many of his articles and books, that nationalism is actually a way of dividing the proletariat. It's telling the French worker that he needs to hate the German worker, and not making them realize that if they come together, they can actually make demands for better work conditions and so on, right? Now, Marx didn't speak in terms of ethnicity or race, but he did speak in terms of nationality. And that's why he said that nationality is really a great obstacle for revolution, for the proletariat revolution that he was hoping for, and for improvement in labor conditions. And I think to a certain extent he was right. I mean, I don't consider myself a Marxist, but I think he had some legitimate grievances, at least the way 19th century industrial conditions were in Europe. But I think that particular disdain for nationalism in the 19th century, we can apply it to the 20th century if you're a Marxist, or even if you're concerned with the plight of the poor, because this is definitely a way to divide and rule the poor. I'm sure that the poor would get better contracts and would get better deals and would get better working conditions if they unite as a class instead of being divided on the basis of skin color, which is what the identitarian left wants you to do.
But the identitarian left is not different from the nativist right. One philosopher is not quite famous today, Eric von Leden. He said that the right is diversitarian, it's not identitarian. Nationalism is a form of identity politics. And furthermore, America first can be divorced from nationalism. Only a fool would enter into a trade agreement that does not elevate the status of the American people. But when many refer to America first, they're being openly protectionist.
Yes, I mean, I don't know much. I wouldn't want to comment much on this America first because I don't know the details of the economic circumstances and whether or not the trade deals with China are good for American China or whether they're detrimental. But so I won't really comment on that. But I do want to comment on what you're saying, that the identitarian left has many points in common with the identitarian right.
Exactly.
Take a look at segregation. I mean, who wants segregation? Well, prior to the 60s, it was clearly the right, and the left was fighting in order to abolish it. But if you take a look at what's going on now in
It is
many
the
places in
left.
the US, it is the left, exactly.
All black graduation. This is the
All black
left.
graduation, segregated dorms, and so on,
Yeah.
right? And it's not only about segregation. It's also, for instance, interracial marriage. Who wants interracial marriage today? Is it more the left or the right? Well, again, before, at least in the US, before it was illegal, it was the left that was pushing again in favor of interracial marriage, right? If you look at it now, the left has reservations against interracial marriage. Now, they might not say quite as blunt,
Yes.
say, oh, person is exoticizing the black person. If they have interracial, biracial children, then those children might be confused. You even see it in the case of adoption. If a white couple adopts a black child, then
It's
they may say, oh,
colonization. That Judge Amy Barrett. That's what Ibrahim Kendi said. That she was colonizing white children.
exactly. Now, I mean, who would agree with that? Well, the identitarian right would also agree with that, because they would say you need to stick to your own kind. Let white people adopt white children, let black people adopt black children. The far right would also say that. You know, this is interesting because you can even see it in the titles of some books. Cornel West, who's a black radical in the US, he has a book that's called Race Matters. I think it's the title of the book. And there is a not so well-known philosopher, but maybe you're aware, you know who he is. His name is Michael Levin.
Yes, I know
He was
Michael Levin.
He was a friend of Philip Rushton and so on. And I mean, obviously I would say he's on the right or the far right. And his book, one of his famous books, the title is
Why
also Race Matters.
Yes.
Yes.
But
So
Michael,
you see here,
we have to be careful with how we use the term far right, because even in far right circles, they don't really agree with each other.
yes, I know. I mean, and I don't know if he's right, far right. All I'm saying is that he's very distant from the left. Some people might even call him far right. I don't know if that's a fair assessment, but my point is that at those two extremes, the titles of the books are the same. Now, maybe the development of the ideas are different, but at bottom, the idea is the same, and that is that race is very important and that we should structure society around the category of race, whereas more people that are more centered, which I think would be my case, would say, well, race should not be the most important thing in someone's life. There are other important variables at play,
It
and
isn't.
maybe we should rest important.
I don't care for race, but I do appreciate racial advocacy. So I have no problem with people who want to separate from other races. I appreciate the biology and the philosophy of racial advocacy, but as a conceptual issue, I'm not really interested in race. But I am interested in long-term evolutionary selections and their implications for modern development.
Sure. Well, as I told you, I mean, I've read some of the books, but I don't feel myself competent to comment on whether or not these theories are right. But regarding the right to be separate from others, I think it's an important aspect too, because how far should the state go in order to enforce integration? And that's a tricky subject. And I haven't come up with a complete answer. I mean, I feel discomfort if I would see on a house saying no blacks allowed, or not in a house, in a business saying no blacks allowed. I mean, should the state force those businesses to allow black clients in?
The market will weed them out. Gary Becker, the market will weed out these people. And as a more contemporary economist notes, racist businesses are more likely to fail. So the market will deal with this issue.
Yes, that's the standard libertarian answer, and it may be right. Who knows? But I mean, but what I was getting at is that even if some say that perhaps the state should intervene because perhaps the market is not as perfect as you may think it is, let's suppose that, I still have doubts about how far should the state go. I mean, should the state force marriage in order for integration, stuff like that? And of course, nobody's proposing forced marriage, but there are definitely cases in between which are a harder call. And I think that's a conversation that we should also be having. I mean, up to what extent should integration be forced? I don't know, because individual rights are also important.
Yeah,
So
and people have very subjective heuristics. So for instance, most people would not oppose to a sign saying no fascist allowed, but they would have a problem with a sign saying no blacks allowed because of their own moral heuristics.
yeah, I suppose those who would defend the right of the state to intervene would say, well, but fascism is something that you choose, being black is not. Fascism has done a lot of damage in the world, being black, no. So, I mean, I don't think the cases are exactly the same, but I do see your point that, for example, if I, as a whatever I am, because I don't fully consider myself white either, coming from a Latin country, we're all mixed there, but let's suppose I consider myself white. And I say, in my sexual life, no black persons allowed.
That's your role, and
Yes,
that's your
exactly.
prerogative. And the
That's
truth is
my
that
point.
most of us opt to marry within our race. Even though we are supportive of interracial marriages, we still marry within our race. This is what Pew has shown.
Yes, indeed. And that goes back to my point. Well, if the state shouldn't intervene in forcing me this or that preference in terms of sexuality, why should the state also why should the state intervene in forcing me to sell this good or that good to everyone of the same races? If I'm allowed to have my private sexual life with people of my own race, why shouldn't I have allowed to have my private business with people of my own race? It's an important question. I still,
Yes.
but I strong philosophical reason. But for now, my gut feeling is that, well, somehow the selling of goods in the market is a bit different from sexuality. But to be honest, I still haven't been able to put my finger on this. I think especially for me, it's clear, for example, in the case of, I'm sure you're aware of these cases, of bakers who don't want to sell cakes for gay marriages, right? And I mean, at first I thought, well, these people are bigots. The state should intervene because no bigotry should be allowed. But then I was pointed out by an important counterexample. Let's say you are a Muslim and you're a Muslim baker, and a client is trying to have a party celebrating, let's suppose, the foundation of Israel or a Zionist party. Are you as a Muslim obligated to provide the cake to a religious celebration that goes against your deep held convictions that Zionism is evil and Israel shouldn't exist or whatever? No, I don't think the Muslim baker should be forced. So why should, by the same token, why should the other baker, the heterosexual baker, be forced to provide a cake for a homosexual party? So in that case, I think it's clearer for me that the baker should have the right to sell the cake to whoever he wants to.
I'm a libertarian and I do agree with the baker, but his argument that it is predicated on Christianity is highly flawed because properly understood, Christianity is a highly liberal religion. It's tolerant, and for the most part, we do not spread the gospel by compulsion. So if you are truly Christian and a man is gay, you shouldn't have a problem baking the cake. However, it becomes an issue when you're baking a cake that could be construed as highly political, like a wedding cake. So you're putting, you're lumping two figurines with men who are about to get married. So in that context, it is a political issue. But under normal circumstances, the Christian baker doesn't have an argument against serving gay people. But for the marriage, it's a different issue. It becomes more political when we're talking about marriage.
Yeah, but even if he didn't have an argument, I still think that he should have the freedom not to provide the cake.
I agree, but
right?
I'm just saying
this is different. But this is different because, I mean, if you test me on vaccine mandates, for example, well, in that case, I would disagree. I would think that vaccine mandates are necessary. But when it comes to a cake, it's such a trivial thing. You will not die from not being sold a cake. You can go somewhere else and buy it. So in that case, for me, it's clear that the baker should not be forced to sell the cake. there may be other more complicated cases such as vaccine mandates and so on, or you know, the sign of no blacks allowed, that I wouldn't go as far. But at least in the case of the baker, my convictions are clear.
Well, well, most people are not hesitant in relation to vaccine. Vaccine hesitancy is overblown. I think the greater issue is fear. And secondly, if you take the COVID vaccine, the vaccine reduces the viral load. This is what studies have been showing. It will not prevent you from contracting COVID, and neither will it prevent you from transmitting the disease. Most sensible people will support a vaccine mandate when the vaccine is more effective. So in the context of COVID, I would not support a vaccine mandate.
Well, I do
Yeah.
support a vaccine mandate because it is true that will protect you from dying, but not necessarily from spreading it. Sure, that may be true, although I would like to see the science on that, but let's assume that it is. But it's still in everybody's interest to get everyone vaccinated because of costs in public health. So if I have to pay taxpayers' money to sustain a healthcare system, and a lot of my tax money will go to an intensive care unit because someone did not want to take the vaccine, well, I wouldn't say that's fair to me. Now you may say, well, but we shouldn't have taxes altogether, right?
Exactly.
The extreme
I don't think it's fair
I
that
know.
I'm a libertarian.
I know. I know. But in the real world, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So for the time being, we'll continue paying taxes. And if we continue paying taxes, then I think in order to make them less oppressive, assuming that they are, well, one way of doing and would refuse vaccines and ultimately suck all the taxpayers' money in ICUs, well, it's not fair to the rest of us. So
Well,
I would, yeah, go ahead.
Most people who contract COVID don't require hospitalization, and neither will they die. Therefore, if we're going to impose a vaccine, it should be for the elderly and those who are most at risk. Let them take the vaccine.
Yes, I agree. But it is, on the other hand, also true that the variants are mutating and younger people are being targeted now, not with vaccines, but by the virus. So I think in order to play it safer, you do need these mandates. Now, I always, as a philosopher and psychologist, I always try to look for counterexamples. We have the case of Typhoid Mary. She didn't do anything wrong. The disease didn't affect her, but she transmitted it to a lot of people. And ultimately, the state in the U.S. is a famous story. They put her on quarantine forever. Now, is it worth saving other people for the good of society of making this one person miserable for the rest of their life? Well, if you uphold individual rights, I think the morality of that particular action, the jury is still out. Nobody still has decided whether the state did the right thing with Typhoid Mary or not. I remember before coronavirus, when I read about this case, I thought that this was an atrocious thing to do to a woman. But now, I don't know, I'm having second thoughts now, because seeing the power of pandemics, it takes an effort from all of us to control it. Now, you may say, well, but coronavirus doesn't kill as many people. Okay, but then it may be a matter of degree and not of kind. What if the virus were stronger? What if we were like Ebola or something like that? Should there be vaccine mandates if there were a vaccine for Ebola?
Two different
cases. I would say so.
Yeah, Ebola is a different disease. Two different cases.
You're right.
And then look at Israel. The numbers are surging in Israel, even though the population is highly vaccinated. Therefore, those who advocate the vaccine mandate are moving the goalposts, and they're saying the purpose of the vaccine mandate is to reduce pressure on the health system. So that's the real argument in favor of the vaccine mandate. It's not about, it is no longer about transmission or the efficacy of the vaccine, but protecting the health system that apparently is under pressure. That's why policymakers are now supporting the vaccine mandate.
Yes, but in the case of Israel, it is true that the cases are going up, but at the same time, Israel is saying we may have to go with a third dose. I would support that.
Mm. I think the
I
larger,
think they are true that the arguments have changed.
yeah, I
I
think
think it's you are right, and there has not been good communication. At first, we were not clear why we needed the vaccine. So at first they said, "Oh, because it will stop transmission." Now it's, "Oh, because we need to relieve the system." So you're right about that. I mean, the argument has changed, but I think the new argument is still a good one. So from my side, I would support the vaccine mandates.
yeah,
Now, how far do we go? I don't know. I mean, again, it's a matter of degree.
and then
When I
and but
consider someone like Typhoid Merit, I think they went too far in that particular
yeah,
case. So
and
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
and therefore, Gabriel, if the vaccine is mandated, however, we don't even need a vaccine mandate to encourage people to take the vaccine. Eventually, I'm assuming that people will mature and accept it. It's slowly but surely that will be the case. But what will we say when the population is 100% vaccinated and COVID is still an issue? What will be the new goalpost? At some point, we have to acknowledge that COVID will be here for some time.
Yes, it is true that we have to learn with it.
You live with
But
it, yes.
yes, it is true. But on the other hand, I think if you take a look at the history of vaccinations, successful eradication of diseases were through vaccine mandates.
Yes,
So
yes,
take a look
yes.
at
But the
take a look at
COVID vaccine is
smallpox.
different. The COVID vaccine is a different vaccine, a completely different vaccine. With the previous vaccines, you accepted it and one could live on and lead a free life. The COVID vaccine is completely different.
Yes, but I think even though, of course, each pandemic is different, but I still think that learning from the history of vaccines, in particular diseases that were just out of control, such as smallpox, it took state intervention.
Yes.
And I think, I don't know if the case of coronavirus is or is not the same or at the same level as smallpox, but I at least am hopeful that if state intervention helps solve the problem in the previous centuries, then maybe right now state intervention could also solve the problem, or at least try to make it better. Now, you're saying, well, the principles of free market might eventually rule and people will come to understand that they do have to vaccinate. I mean, as a general rule, I do have faith in the free markets, but I don't think it's perfect. So I think here and there you may need state intervention. But
Well, some people may present contradicting data, but Gabriel, I tell you, this conversation is quite compelling, but unfortunately, I have to wrap up.
right,
We have
indeed.
been
Well,
talking for nearly 1 hour and we've been talking for over 1 hour and 10 minutes. So I have to
yes.
wrap up. But it was a pleasure to speak to you, Gabriel, and maybe in another dispensation, we can actually analyze your article in depth, because for today we went off on several tangents. But it was a
Indeed, but
pleasure to speak to you, Gabriel.
Yes, that's the beauty of a conversation, and I've enjoyed this hour and a half very much, and I hope to visit Jamaica one day. As I lived in the Cayman, so I
Where
had
are you
a
living?
lot of
Where do you live
Jamaicans.
now? In Cayman or the Middle East?
No, I live in the Middle East now. I live in
Okay.
Dubai, but I spent some time in Cayman and I met many Jamaicans. So it's been my pleasure, and many of the Jamaicans I met were very, very nice people. And now you're one more of you're a further addition to that list of people of very nice Jamaicans and very smart, intelligent Jamaicans that I've met, such as
All
yourself.
right. Thanks, Gabriel. Bye.
All right.